Councilmember Shulman will be here in about 10 minutes. So at that time, we may go back then and approve the minutes, and then at that point, we can make a motion. So what I'll do, we'll just turn it over to Gina to just begin to carry us through the agenda until Councilmember Shulman arrives.
All right. So if Crosland would like to go ahead and do their presentation,
Sure, absolutely.
it would be a good time.
To go first.
Get to go first.
So here's our audit planning book. It's very summarized for thousands of hours of audit work. It's about as summarized as you can get. Starting on the second page is kind of the general agenda. I'm going to go through our team members are, our responsibilities as opposed to management's responsibilities, the fact that we are independent, talk about fraud risk a little bit, our audit methodology going forward for this year's audit, a little bit about the single audit, update you on what to expect there, any significant activities, any prior year issues, and then some new statements and timelines. So on page 3 is our engagement team members. If you can remember last year, we had a lot of movement on this page. We rotated a lot. Basically all the largest areas, we rotated the partners. This is my second year to be the overall engagement partner on this job. On page 4, talks about our responsibilities as opposed to management's responsibilities. In general, we're expressing opinions about whether financial statements are in material respects in conformity with GAAP. That includes government audit procedures and our uniform guidance on the single audit. We obviously have to maintain independence, attitude of professional skepticism throughout the audit. And then we also have to report to this audit committee as well as management on any findings we may have, whether it be significant deficiencies in internal controls or fraud or any non-compliance. Management on the other hand, their responsibility is preparing the financial statements of which we audit. They adopt proper accounting policies. A lot of times those policies have estimates and reserves in them. We look at those estimates and reserves to make sure they're in compliance with GAAP and are reasonable. Establish and maintaining the effective internal controls, of which we will test at different levels, which I'll get into. Preventing and detecting fraud, and then disclosing to the audit committee and us if they find any deficiencies in internal controls or fraud. On page 5, addresses independence, and we are, in fact, in appearance, we are independent in accordance with AICPA's Code of Professional Conduct, Rule 101. Page 6 addresses fraud risk specifically. Obviously, in the audit, we do look at inherent risk and control risk, which makes up your risk of material misstatement or your audit risk. But additionally, SAS 99 requires us to look at fraud risk. And how we do that, on the left side of the page, we gather information. One of those things are brainstorming amongst all the people who are involved in the audit on our side and all the knowledge base that they have. We also inquire of management or investigate unusual looking transactions or things. And then we test those unusual or things that we may see for management override. We also we identify risks out of those unusual transactions. It may be just manual adjusting journal entries, which we'll test. They may be significant changes in estimates, things such as that. And then we'll design not only internal control testing measures, but we'll also design substantive procedures to cover those anomalies. And then evaluation of audit evidence, that's largely communication amongst our internal staff on everything we found and kind of putting all the pieces together to see where the risk may lie. But it's also communicating to different levels of management and the audit committee what we found. On page 7 is our audit methodology and approach. Really, it's a four-prong approach: audit planning and risk assessment. We're currently doing the planning right now and the risk assessment. Control, evaluation, and testing. So there's certain areas, which I'll get to next, there's certain areas that we can rely on the controls, and then we're going to test controls and rely that those controls identify and produce the numbers that are correct. There's another approach, substantive testing, and that's like looking at your invoices or drilling down and looking at, third-party confirmations and things such as that. And then the reporting phase and the review of the report is also obviously a large part of this audit. On page 8, I get into the audit methodology and approach a little bit. On the left side of the page are some of the areas where we will test controls, evaluate those controls, and determine whether we can rely on them. In the past, these areas on the left are areas we've been able to rely on controls. And on the right, substantive testing is generally the approach we take. Now, they go back and forth. There's controls that also seep into the substantive testing, but, we have to evaluate, what is the best use of our time to make sure that the numbers are materially correct. And that's what we're attempting to do by going back and forth with this control testing and substantive testing. On page 9 is the single audit. This is the uniform guidance audit. We've predicted or expected what our two major programs will likely be, Department of Education Title I grants and then the Child Nutrition Grant. I mean, that's basically based on every third year we have to test a major program, and we also have to gain coverage, 40% in Metro's case. I think all of Metro has been working hard to become a low-risk auditee, which gets us down to 20% testing. I think if we get through 6/30/19's year end without any material weaknesses or any going concern issues, that in 6/30/20 we'll finally get to that low-risk auditee level. Currently, for 6/30/19, really the only reason that I've identified that Metro will be high risk is from the going concern with the hospital 2 years ago. On page 10, just some of the significant activities and issues.
How long is it, how long does that last? The going concern from 2 years ago, how long will that impact this?
This will be the last year, 6/30/19. So 6/30/20, you should be in the clear as long as they don't have another one this year.
And while we're on this, the going concern triggered really by the uncertainty of the supplemental appropriation in effect.
That was
In effect,
largely it, yeah.
It was the having the small one and then the supplemental that in effect triggered. Okay, so if we just didn't do that, you wouldn't be living under the going concern issue today.
If you had just done what?
Appropriated the normal amount as opposed to dropping it down.
Yeah, I was supposed so, and I will say, David Hunt is the first partner on the hospital, so
We did.
there's probably people in this room that
Yeah,
have
2
no
years
more.
ago, we had a management issue from, remember, for several months. They didn't have a CFO. That was part of it. But the main was the timing of the appropriations.
Right.
So we had to issue before the council actually approved it.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey,
Your Honor. Sorry, I'm late.
You're fine. We are on, unless you have questions on the first 10 pages, we're on page 11.
I really don't want to go back.
Well, we'll be around, so you're
Okay,
welcome
that's
to ask. So page 11, we're bringing up some prior year issues and recommendations. We didn't have any material weaknesses. The significant deficiencies we had, I think, are clear, that related to the uniform guidance, and we had a classification, or a classification of cluster that was incorrect for a couple of years, and we got that cleared up in last year's single audit. We did have other, what we call management letter comments, which didn't rise to significant deficiency or material weaknesses that we list here as other control deficiencies. That, during this audit, we will look at those specifically, make sure they're cleared, and do whatever we can to help management to clear those issues. Page 12 are the new statements coming out. the new GASBs. There's a couple of them that will be applicable to this year, 83 and 88. 88 are really disclosures. We'll make sure the proper disclosures and wording are in there concerning 88. 83 addresses certain asset retirement obligations. We'll have to get into there and see if they're, the landfill issue, that was solved years ago with, I think, GASB 18 or something a long time ago. These are asset retirement obligations for tangible capital assets other than landfills. So in metro government, is there anything out there that possibly has a liability that we know is coming in the future? That's what it's trying to address. Sewage treatment plant facilities, that's one that probably at Water and Sewer we'll be asking a lot about. Can't think of really any major other ones. I mean, there's no nuclear power plants or anything that 83 specifically addresses. But we'll be looking into that during the audit. 13 is timeline. And 14 is the anticipated completion of all the deliverables that we have for the audit. And then finally, 15 are contacts, if you so wish to contact us at any time. What questions can I answer? Or areas to further explain or?
Super quickly, your contract is for the just
Through
the term.
6/30/19.
Through 6/30/19.
So that's over?
It will be in about 8,000 hours.
Not quite.
Maybe not quite, but,
So remind us what happens with that?
well, we hope you just rehire us.
It's not us.
But that's not yeah.
That's a management
That's not,
decision.
that's
Can I-
not my decision.
Going back to the Bredesen administration, what has typically happened is we've gone through a procurement process, through procurement, made a selection, and made a recommendation to this body. To the audit board, it's the three audit board members, right? They've usually accepted that recommendation. One time they did not. So they have the authority to, go to another, number two or number three or whatever that applied.
So the audit board is at work with that now, and the audit board is the vice mayor?
Vice mayor, the chair of the budget and finance, and then the chair of the school board. And they have not started that process. I think the last time we did this, we started it, when did we start it? Like when the audit was near
Yeah, we
completion,
want to
first
start
of the
it
year.
when the audit is about to wrap up. So
Yeah.
we'll probably get the RFP out in November, December.
Yeah.
And the selection would be maybe February, March timeframe.
And I think what we would need to do is touch base with those three individuals, whoever they are at that point in time, and make sure that's the way they want to proceed.
Is that a 3-year contract?
5.
That's 5.
It's a 1-year contract, but with the intention of renewing it for 5 years. The state is also a party to this contract, and they only allow 1 year at a time. I think because they want to make sure the audit is, done appropriately before they sign on for another year.
Yeah. Very good. Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Sure.
Well, now that we have a quorum, I guess we'll go back and approve minutes for the last 2 meetings. And if we can, we just approve these both as a set. So what we are approving minutes for the June 5th meeting and the April 16th meeting.
Move to approve.
Second.
Okay, second. Any questions? Okay, all in favor say aye. Aye. Okay. All right, well, I guess we'll go to Gina again.
Okay. So the next item under new business, the very first bullet, is a request that we received from Judge Joe Binkley Jr. for the audit of the Davidson County Drug Court because they had a change in management on June 27th, so as of July 1st. And that letter is on page 16.
Sounds like a good idea.
So you need a motion to go for it. I second what I take to be Bob's
Any
motion.
questions? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
On the next bullet point 3, we're going to discuss the follow-up audit of the Office of Fleet Management. And I'm going to turn that over to Lauren.
We recently completed a follow-up audit of the Office of Fleet Management. I currently have Stacy Wall here with me from General Services, the Assistant Director. We performed this audit because we originally did an audit back in September of 2017. Fleet is such a large part of Metro that we found it prudent to go back and follow up on the 19 recommendations that were made and accepted during that audit. Those recommendations spanned things from utilization monitoring, scheduling of vehicles, take-home vehicles, and compliance with policies and procedures. It also followed up on any outstanding recommendations that were made during a 2012 fuel management audit. From this follow-up, we found that 15 of the recommendations have been completely implemented and verified. 3 of them were not applicable anymore. This had to do with the fact that Fleet has turned their parts rooms over to Advance Auto, and so some of our recommendations related to those, but they're no longer applicable. Fleet had actually started to implement some of them before making this change. The one outstanding recommendation was related to the 2012 fuel management audit. This has to do with doing reconciliations and verifications of fuel inventory. Fleet has made lots of progress on setting up contracts and a purchase order to do this. They're just having some technical difficulties getting it actually implemented, but they hope to have this implemented by the end of July. So as of then, it should be all of these recommendations should have been implemented or no longer applicable. Are there any questions?
Great, thanks.
The next audit that we will cover is audit of development conditions, and that is going to be presented by Laura Henry.
Okay, so this is the audit of development conditions. This audit focused on specific plan or SP zoning projects, which are becoming increasingly more popular in Nashville. Each SP has to be approved by the Metropolitan Council, and a lot of them have certain conditions written into the ordinance with them. So the first objective of this audit was to determine if there was a process in place to ensure that those conditions associated with the projects were being met and enforced, which we were essentially unable to determine. The process prior to council approval is really strong, but after the project's approved, the communication kind of stops. The project falls more in the hands of the codes department, but the codes department isn't involved in the planning process in the beginning. So they're not essentially made aware of the conditions that they're supposed to be enforcing, or they don't understand the context. So clearly there's a lack of communication there. And then there's also no clearly defined lines of responsibility of who's supposed to be enforcing it. And then there's no central process owner to hold everyone accountable and see the whole project through from that initial application to completion. So we recommended utilizing the CityWorks and e-permit system to ensure that the conditions and their explanations are available to inspectors, to include all parties responsible for enforcing the conditions in the process of writing the conditions, implementing written policies and procedures that define those responsibilities and reporting structures, and to establish a central process owner to oversee the project from start to finish. All these recommendations were accepted by the planning and codes departments. And then the second objective was to determine if the cost of implementing the conditions is allocated correctly to either the developer or Metro government. And we were also unable to determine this. The ordinances do not consistently designate a financially responsible party. Many of the infrastructure-related conditions overlap with normal scope of work for public works, such as sidewalks, streetlights, intersection design. So without the ordinance specifying who's financially responsible, we can't really determine if Metro or the developer should be responsible for those. So we recommended that to create a written policy that outlines the acceptable infrastructure spending amounts by Metro, and then to document the required steps to take if that expected spending exceeds the acceptable range. So this recommendation was accepted by Public Works. And that's about it. So with us today is also Lucy Kemp, the Director of Planning, Bill Herbert, Director of Codes, and Sharon Wallstrom from Public Works. So if you have any questions for myself or for the department?
Okay. I like this, particularly the central process owner now, but I guess my question would be, because I know how much goes into the initial stuff with an SP, does everybody have it? Is it one person or are there three people? What do you come up with in terms of a central process person?
I think that is a policy question that the three main departments need to work out. It's which department by mission is most effectively positioned to ensure that all of the conditions are met. It's really clear that planning is responsible through council, and even at the permitting phase, we do a review to make sure that the conditions are met. It's the having the boots on the ground person who goes out and looks at the actual site and says, yes, this meets that requirement, or no, that I think Bill and I have agreed, Bill Herbert with Codes and I have agreed to do an assessment and provide a recommendation to you about what department is appropriate for that. And then I think Public Works was appropriately engaged on the question of how you separate out the specific Public Works improvements. And I think they would need to provide that assessment, but they do have boots on the ground folks who can go out and verify.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just listening to it, I mean, I think it's difficult to try to figure out because I know everybody has different roles.
Yes.
So you're going to have to find somebody that can understand all three roles and kind of watch it as you go all the way through. Is that the idea behind it?
Yes.
And then make sure that you understand what's happening up here at the first part, and then at the second part, and maybe at the third part.
Yes, and we have to make sure that that entity or individual has the skill set to not only inspect foundations, which is where Codes is typically looking at health safety issues, but also architectural features that have become more typical in SPs.
At first, I thought you had just met with Codes and you were going to leave Public Works out and then make them do it.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Sharon, I can't even see them, so I'll
Yeah, at
just...
first it's like, oh, but you'd lift them out. Okay, thank you.
Well, I want to thank you for your write-up, and if you were to type what you said up, I think that would be outstanding. I'm hearing Codes and Public Works and Planning that everybody agrees that this has become a bit of a problem, and it will need a policy adjustment to do that. And you all are working together to do that. I wondered if it's too much to ask for kind of a timetable or a commitment in the nature of busy governments to try to, you know, is that a council action that's going to be required, do you think, to kind of perfect the follow-up on this, or would that be entirely internal?
Bill, you're not kicking me yet. So, I mean, we agreed to a date to propose for the first proposal, which related to Codes and Planning. We agreed to a date to prepare a set of recommendations. I do think that in the event that more staff or resources or different kinds of resources are necessary, we would need to vet that with Finance Department and then, of course, come to council and say we have a need. This is the profile of that individual and what their focus is going to be. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So you've identified the issue exactly, and the issue really is Codes Department and Code staff is not involved during the implementation of the SP. We're not involved in that process. The problem is that our building inspectors are out there inspecting the construction. Now they are trained in the building codes. They are trained in the residential and the plumbing and the electrical and the mechanical. But every SP is different, and they are not equipped, quite frankly, to interpret what the legislation says or to really administer it. Now, with that being said, we recognize that there's a breakdown there between what happens during the initiation process and then what happens during the administration and enforcement process. So I think we've agreed that it may require some additional personnel in which to do it, because quite frankly, neither one of our departments are equipped singly to do that. But I think we can agree to work that out.
Well,
You've hit the issue exactly.
well, because again, I think everybody's looking, I mean, there is a new council coming in a few weeks, really, and I think this would be something that people, my guess, would be excited to address, and that the audit usefully has kind of found a crack that I guess people expect to be repaired, and that for you all to be the doctors and come up with initially the right prescription. Okay, thank you very much.
I got two questions that overlap a little bit. So one, I was just going to ask, everybody still stands by the deadlines that are in the report? And then secondly, I was going to ask, and it really, I guess this is more a vice mayor thing, but whoever ends up being the chair of Planning and Zoning Committee and whoever ends up being in charge of the Codes Committee, it would be great if whatever working group you guys have got going, that you could start running updates to those folks, so none of us ever have to hear when you get to the end of the year, budget season, gee, I didn't know, whatever, was going on. And so I think it would be great if you guys could reach out to, and if for whatever reason they're busy and they don't want to hear the updates, I'm sure the vice mayor would encourage them to want to hear the updates.
Yeah, because we'll pass a resolution and we'll scare everybody with that.
That's all I got.
Let me follow up. I just had my thought disappear. I'll get it back.
Let me ask a question while you're thinking. The timeline has been referred to a couple of times, and it goes to 12/31/20, which puts it even beyond another audit year. And I'm just curious as to why that timeline is so long. Just establish procedures or a written policy. Does it take a year and a half to do that?
I mean,
I'm sure it does, but
it's going to be about the people, and they need money to have people to implement whatever they come up with.
I think it's two things. As Bill alluded to, we're talking about a function that really doesn't rest easily in either department. And so we're going to need to look at the mission of both sections to figure out where that belongs, and then make sure that whatever we propose is going to be effective and meet the needs of the people and their expectations and council's expectations. And then second, there's going to be a resource request, I think, to go along with that. And so we don't make those lightly. But I'm happy if there's an interim type move that we need to make and document here. I'm happy to do that if that would be more satisfactory.
Sure.
I remember what it was. The ordinance that creates the SP. Did you all look at that from the standpoint of making sure that, we get it right in the bill, but that it's clearly, or it's set out clearly enough so that when it's, at this point, when it's handed off, but now you're going to have somebody trying to watch it all throughout. Because I think that's what's thrown people. Because there's so much discussion usually about the SP up front, but then you give it off to the codes department and they haven't been involved in the discussions. So have you all looked at it from the standpoint of figuring out whether we've got it, the process clear enough so that it's very clearly laid out, so that whoever's doing this has the list and they're able to understand it and follow it? And maybe there's a second part to it until we figure all this other stuff out, is because we could put anything in that SP and they could interpret it completely differently when it comes to the codes department or to Public Works.
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question exactly, but first of all, I have appreciated the work that you did, because I think this is it's a complex question, and I appreciate your investigation, and anything we can do to make our work better, we want to do. I think we need to look at SPs holistically. This audit dealt with a piece of that, but something you said has been a little bit in my own thinking about when SPs are appropriate and why. Sometimes we use SPs as a way to solve a very unique problem, and that's when they're appropriate. But very often we're using SPs to address deficits in the form standards of Title 17, and that's not appropriate. And so while that wasn't a specific question of the audit, I think that's some work that we at planning need to do in coordination with council members to talk about why we're using them and relying on them so much. A result of that could be that we have some different standards in that sort of that original ordinance establishing them to talk about when they're appropriate. And I think that clarity will help resolve some of the other issues, because it's an issue that we're relying on them so heavily. It suggests that there are deficits elsewhere.
And I'd like to add to that when Lucy came on as director and when I was the zoning administrator, I've been something of a vocal critic of SP zoning from the get-go. In my mind, it's fraught with problems. In any event, that being said, we have had a fantastic relationship in trying to work SPs and make them actually work, when in my mind, really, they just shouldn't. So hats off. We're continuing those types of conversations. And Lucy, you're right, this has identified one crack and a number of bigger issues that involve SPs. The good news is we're working together. We have been, and we'll continue to do so.
Well, and I think going back to what Councilmember Cooper said, and that is, you've got a new council that will be seated sometime in September, and it's a good time for everybody to take a step back and for information to be provided that says, exactly what you said. If that's the appropriate time to say it, so that people take another look at it before they start filing SPs.
That said, I guess we got former at-large, two current at-large, with no real dog in the hunt on SPs. So I consider myself sort of a spectator on those. I view it in part as part of the incredibly intense growth rate of the city is if you fixed Title 17, like the only thing we know for sure is 18 months from now it's going to be busted again because we continue to grow so fast. And so figuring, sure, SPs shouldn't be a crutch, but I think it's a symptom of the accelerated growth that we're not going to be able to, everything we would have made up about short-term rentals 4 years ago to be fixed in Title 17 wouldn't be right today, and that's a big chunk of the current tension on SPs, and 18 months from now that might be gone and it's going to be some other tension. So I feel like figuring out in this time of high growth, for the foreseeable future, SP is going to be the refuge of a district council member who can't quite figure it out, and so this is going to be an issue for a while. Even if we fix it, we should fix Title 17, but it's going to be wrong pretty quickly, I think.
I'm just wondering where you're going to find this person who is good at planning, good at codes, good at planning, can understand all this.
It's you, Jim.
Thank you, Bob. I was going to say it was you.
We'll find him.
Well, and ultimately, presumably, so there's a recommendation, the new planning committee works with you closely on your recommendation, comes up with policy change if there has to be. You're adding additional staff. There's conceivably another component to it, which is a upcharge to SP permits that would pay for the inspection and compliance function of this. That would presumably require a study.
I think that's one avenue we'd like to investigate.
Okay.
But yes, historically we've had a study.
So you would put that in your recommendation for an effective fee study for
Yes.
that, and that would be formally part of that, okay?
Okay, any other questions? Lucy, thank you. Laura, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
The next report is the report on the Barnes Fund, and Bill Walker will be presenting that.
Okay, our office did an audit of the Barnes Fund. We have with us today Ms. Hannah Davis, who is the Affordable Housing Program Director, and Ms. Friskus Warren, who is the Chairperson for the Metropolitan Housing Trust Fund Commission. We appreciate you all being here. The audit period covered July 2013 through June 30th, 2018, and simply stated it sought to answer three questions. One, is Barnes funding being awarded to qualified entities who can help meet the mission of the Barnes Fund and who can help meet various program objectives? Secondly, are the recipients of Barnes funding, are they being monitored to make sure those program objectives are being met? So let's say we're giving an entity, say $500,000 to produce A, B, and C. Are they actually going back and producing A, B, and C? And then finally, are reports being generated in a timely and accurate manner so that stakeholders can make meaningful decisions? And what we found, they have very well-written, well-developed policies and procedures, and they do a really good job of monitoring the construction cycle. So the way it works, you have, let's say you're an entity, you're getting $500,000 to produce X number of units. They don't just give you the money up front. It's more of a percentage of completion method. So you start out, you get your license, your permits, things of that nature, you get a certain percentage. Next step may be the foundation, various other things. They'll send a contractor or inspector out there to look at to make sure those things are being done. Then they'll release another set of funds. In terms of recommendations, I'd say the top two, one has to do with monitoring subsequent to the construction process. So once the units are built, going back out there to make sure who's occupying those units, that they meet income eligibility requirements, that they're meeting rental rate thresholds. Another thing, and this has to do with performance measures, and we used to have these in our old reports quite a bit. We got away from it. We're trying to get back to it, which is where, okay, you define, identify, measure, and report those things that will help you determine whether you're meeting the objectives of this particular program. So for like this particular case, it might be we want to produce X number of affordable housing units within a given time period. Or we want to make sure we're monitoring all the recipients of Barnes funding at 100% within a certain time period. But you basically want to identify what makes this program successful and report it to various stakeholders. So those are kind of your two main recommendations. In terms of the grant application process, they do have a good process in terms of scoring and reviewing the different applications and whatnot. The difficulty was that the documentation to support that was somewhat spotty. Sometimes it was there, sometimes it wasn't. So it's hard to determine whether it was actually occurring or not. One control they didn't have, again, they have good policies and procedures, but one control that we recommend would be to have a conflicts of interest type statement. So, you've got these developers, you've got the people that are help scoring these entities. Let's just, it's not a bad idea just to sit back, make sure you don't have any conflicts and sign off to that or recuse yourself from that particular process. In terms of reporting, the time period that we looked at, there'd only been one report issued. There were some inaccuracies between the report and some of the internal documents that we looked at. One thing, too, there's land that's being donated to the Barnes Fund. While that was being recorded, the value of that land was not being recorded. So we recommend that you attach a value to the land that's going over to the Barnes Fund.
You're talking about the current fair value?
Yes. Some other things that...
How would you determine the current fair value?
Well, we recommend you get an appraiser.
For each of these? Okay.
One thing I would like to say, these guys have been very receptive to our recommendations, which we appreciate. I know we were talking last week about, given the recommendations that we have and given the nature of this program, it might not be a bad idea for us to come back out there. And they were asking, well, when could you come back out there? I'm like, well, maybe 2 years. And they're like, well, that's way too long. We want you to come back out here. We want to make sure we get this correct, and we want you to come back out there and verify. So we appreciate that attitude towards our audit. But that's a high-level summary of the report. We're happy to answer any questions that you guys might have.
I don't have any questions about the report. So I'm going to say some stuff just so it's, on the video, but it's stuff that you guys know and some of the stuff we've talked about, and some of it is, says point blank in the report. One of the things that's discussed in the action plan, the response from the fund, is talking about how the former administration dissolving and the people who are running the Barnes Fund getting other jobs in other cities administratively put the program in no administration for some amount of time, and different people in the mayor's office working their rears off to try to hold it all together. And that's obviously a bad look for the city generally, that change in mayor and a significant office sort of falls apart for some number of months, because it demonstrates basically what the report has found, that there wasn't enough substance to the organization to weather that. And my perspective is, okay, so that's fine. The fund is still relatively new, kind of a startup, but the lessons learned from a change in the mayor's office, and one person gets a job in another city and a second person gets a job in another city, and the organization basically ceases to exist administratively for some amount of time. That's not what the city intends on its affordable housing program. And I think it leads, out in the community, I hear from people who love the Barnes Fund and people who hate the Barnes Fund all basically have the same criticism, which is they don't really know what we're getting for it necessarily, and they don't know how many units it is, and some people think it's a black hole for money. The people who don't like it, people who do like it, don't think enough is being done with the money, and this finding number one about what is the measure of success. We've basically been working on that as a city for a long time, and I think those of us in the council who are on the ad hoc affordable housing committee have basically, because I 1,000% believe, and I think every council member 1,000% believes, the intentions of the humans who are people who are making it work are very good intentions. There's been a bit of a free pass of stiffening up the organization and doing these things, so a change in mayor doesn't crater the organization for some amount of time. So I very much like the idea of coming back in a year. I very much like the commitment to making it so the organization isn't susceptible to one or two people go away and it's in a ditch. Because it's not a startup anymore. There's too much money going into it. There's too much money more money that's going to be going into it, I think, in future years. And there fundamentally isn't any measure of success, and it fundamentally did fall apart for some amount of time with just a couple of people changing. So I'm personally still of the mindset of I very much want to, despite sort of a terrible reading report, to say, okay, well, we're moving from startup to grown-up organization. This isn't going to happen again. It's going to be a learning opportunity, and I do appreciate everybody's efforts on that, both full-time and volunteer board members. So thanks.
Well, and I want to give some positive feedback that from what I hear out in the community, how grateful everybody is to the improved management and the attention that you all have been able to produce. And I think it's discernible to everybody in the space, the improvement, and I'm grateful for that. A quick question, or I should know this, are any of the staff civil service? Is this a civil service?
I think your mayor's office staff, so I don't think mayor's office staff are civil service.
So there's no kind of formal departmental civil service
I don't know the
establishment?
answer to the question. The salary comes from the Barnes Fund allocation, and the Barnes Fund commissioners participated in the hiring process, but I don't know this technical status of the employee.
Well, it's just following up on, Bob's point in terms of institutionalizing an excellent sort of independent protected that is very process-oriented, and has to be if it's going to have the amount of money that it needs to have going forward. Should it be rethought in a way that with those goals in mind? But again, I didn't know, but it sounds like it is definitely not, because you would probably know.
Mayor's office staff, yeah.
Okay, appreciate it, thank you.
Any questions? Any other questions? Thank you so much. Bill?
Thank you. Thanks to Bill for all his work on this. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And next, we will discuss the audit of the Metro Arts Commission, and Innocent is going to present that for us.
I present to you the audit of the Metro Arts Commission. Why we did the audit? We did the audit because our last audit was in 2010. The audit report was dated February 24, 2010. And also the amount of grants that has been expended has gone up above our previous 3 million risk threshold. And also there is a new executive director. I guess before I continue, I want to recognize the Metro Art Commission staff, Caroline Vincent, who is the new executive director, Ian Myers, the finance director, and also Kim McDonald is here to represent finance, because finance was part of the process. The objective of the audit, we have two objectives. Did the Metro Art Commission establish and implement its program in accordance with Metro codes, Tennessee annotated codes, the Commission's rules and regulations, and also its own internal policies and guidelines. And also did the Commission follow Metro government fiscal policies in administering its programs. Each of these objectives had questions that form part of our audit procedures that we, and those are identified in the report. The scope of the audit was all grants and public arts projects within the fiscal years of 2018 and 2017. The notable observations which form part of our recommendations relate to the 1% public art fund. We identify some projects that were not included in the computation of the fund due to public art. And our recommendation there is to expand on the items of construction project that should and should not be included in the computation. The other notable recommendation is a lack of sufficient and appropriate evidence for programs that have been implemented. So there are detailed guidelines for staff to follow. But in terms of, okay, we are doing this, what is it that we need to collect? What documents do we need to collect to make sure that somebody looking at this will know that this program has been properly implemented? Example, payment to, evidence of payment to contractors, and also the closing report doesn't have adequate information for us to substantiate all the projects that was done. The other noted observation is related to donated artworks. And the Commission has detailed guidelines developed for all Metro departments to follow to ensure that the code is applied to, but we noted some of the departments did not follow that. at least we identified 2 departments that did not follow that based on the 4 donations that we examined. So the recommendation is that they should continue to work with Metro Council to let the departments know that this is something that has to be followed. I understand some of those departments have their own boards and they have their own rules, and therefore they find it difficult to kind of enforce the, I'm talking about the Arts Commission, find it difficult to work with those boards for them to follow those guidelines. So I think they will need some help. That's my recommendation to be able to make sure that those guidelines are followed. I believe there are some risk elements to the Metro government regarding that. We had 17 recommendations, which are on page 32 to 36 of the brochure, and 3 of those have already been, all of them have been accepted, 3 of them have been implemented according to the response from the Commission. I'll yield to any more questions.
It says completion date of the recommendations. Most of them are July 1. It's 2020, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be about a year from now.
Yes.
I have a quick question. It says here on what we found, the 1% public art fund computation did not include all eligible construction projects. Would you just talk a little bit about that? Because you would think that that would be maybe the easiest thing to compute or capture.
Well, it might sound easy. But, I mean, I'm sure you can jump in, but let me just explain what I know first. And then it might sound easy, but just about 3 days ago, I realized that land, which was originally part of the computation, based on legals and finances interpretation, is not included. So that is why in the recommendation, I stated that you should break down what in a construction project is included and not included. That will help everyone to understand the computation.
So this is public construction projects. So, for example, the jail or the police station would be included in the eligible package. And so at some point there's a budget for that, and that is submitted to finance, and then it either, and this is 1% of the budgeted amount or the 1% of the actual amount. But in that budget, it would be, that 1% would be in there.
Yeah, and when the budget is set, that money is set aside in the budget and contingency. Another thing that complicates it is the way the original legislation was written. The 1% doesn't become available until the bonds are issued. And I think probably the legislation was written at the time when we issued bonds before we started projects, and now we use commercial paper in the interim. So that's another complication that we do set it aside, but it doesn't get moved to the arts budget until the bonds are issued.
Until the bond is actually issued.
Correct.
So so there's an additional delay to the Arts Commission receiving the money. And then is this, has been undercounting, I suppose?
What they found in the 4 exceptions that were found in this, two of them were, I think, more of a misinterpretation on our part, and I think we, understand, the perspective. The computation has to, if it's not a new building, if it's for improvements, those improvements have to be at least 50% of the value of the building. So there's another step in the process of getting an estimate for what is the value currently of the building, and does this additional capital, is it 50%? So there were 2 instances where there were some additional monies because there were an improvement budget, and I'm just making this up, of $20 million, and they needed a little bit more money because of cost overruns, and it was the additional money that wasn't included. There was one instance where, and again, as Innocent said, this doesn't apply to just land purchases. But if it's a parks purchase, if it's parks land that has improvements on it, then the construction value of the improvements does apply. And we had one instance that what was in the budget was soccer fields, and there was a big land acquisition. But we didn't know until, after you see what the money was spent for, that some of that was actually for construction for, bleachers or, whatever went into those soccer fields. And then there was one that was another one that was for a school that was just, quite frankly missed. But the computations kind of happen over time, and you have to go back and, figure out what the value is if it's improvements, and it is a little bit complicated.
So I'm sorry, just to pull on that thread a little bit.
Sure.
So MMPS, public construction projects, also fall in the 1%?
That's correct. That's correct.
But you could look at then the backlog, the $1 billion+ backlog, and in fact, the Arts Commission could look into that backlog and compute relatively accurately what the money it would be owed in the future years as soon as it was bonded, right? So you have vision into the pipeline.
You do, into the pipeline, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And you think you have that sufficiently, the vision into the pipeline?
I think so. I think we haven't been really detailed. We receive a spreadsheet. We, of course, go back and check it and look at it and sort of absorb that, but we haven't done our own sort of projections, to be honest. We just sort of have taken the word of, what's been given to us, and like, great, looks good. But I think this sort of process will give us a chance to sort of think about improvements and how do we want to do our own projections within our own internal.
So it's MMPS, public buildings, hardscape infrastructure also, just buildings. It's got to have a roof on it.
Not infrastructure, not like streets and roads infrastructure.
Okay, but it has to have a roof on it for it to qualify, basically.
Unless it's an improvement to a parks parcel that, would be, like I said, the soccer fields, or, conceivably if you have a greenway and you have construction on the pathway.
Right. Sorry, let me pull on another thread. Revenue bonded public construction, the new soccer stadium, would that be included in this or not?
It's just geo.
It's geo entirely, period, the end. Okay. All right, thank you.
So one of the questions I had when I was reading this and listening to it is, I'm not sure why this is it doesn't seem like it should be Metro Arts that is fixing, especially the 1% problem, because it does seem reasonable to me that they would rely on other agencies to tell them what they're being allocated for the 1%. And so I'm a little, like, what are they supposed to do to fix it? Audit information they're getting from other people. So I'm a little fuzzy about whether fixing this really resides with Metro Arts.
Well, it doesn't reside with them, but they are the process owners, and they will have to work with finance. Just like she said, the calculations come from finance.
So they don't have any ability to fix it.
Well, I think they have the ability to fix it by working with finance.
Bob, are you saying that one of the comments should be for finance?
Yeah,
Really?
I mean, we can't possibly think that Metro Arts is supposed to be examining construction spreadsheets to figure out what the right dollar amount is, right? There's no way that that's a Metro Arts job. There's professionals and a bunch of other departments that are figuring that out.
Okay, but it does affect their bottom line. If they don't have the money, they are not going to fund the project.
Right, but just from a business point of view, are we saying that Metro Arts should go hire some construction engineers so they can figure out for themselves off of budgets?
No, that's not what I'm recommending. I'm recommending that they work with finance and legal, because some of the items that we identified in the report, they came out to be not supposed to be included, and that those came from finance and legal. So if they get that understanding, I think they should be able to move forward.
I'm going to say something I haven't said in 4 years of being on this committee. Like, I don't think this is their problem. I think it's somebody else's problem to fix.
Okay, well, I guess that's why the finance department is here as well.
All right, which I appreciate very much. And I guess the second thing, which is sort of I guess the second thing is, can you send Jameson and copy me a specific suggestion about how to fix that nuance so commercial paper can be used to fund this stuff in real time rather than waiting for bonds to be issued?
Yes, yes.
Like one of my colleagues from Antioch likes to say every opportunity that a Metro Arts Commission appointee comes through is that there's a high school out in Antioch that's got a space for a piece of art that no piece of art was ever put there. If there was a real-time allocation of 1%, because it came out of commercial paper, maybe there'd be a piece of art sitting in front of that high school right now. So I would like, if you could recommend that to Jameson, I would appreciate it. And then I think the last thing was, is there a requirement that, I'm assuming the answer is no, is there a requirement that the 1% be spent on site, or it just goes into a fund to
It
go
goes into a
wherever?
fund. It's pooled, which is also why there's not art everywhere that generates funds into the, because it wouldn't be possible just by capacity and also the funds. I mean, you might get $10,000 from one site and you can't really do anything. For an exterior piece of art, you would not get very much. So that's.
If that one council member is right about the high school in Antioch, it's sort of a really terrible right hand not knowing what left hand is doing, that there's literally an empty spot in front of the high school for art that we as a city didn't manage to get anything there. And maybe the 1% wasn't even funded for a couple of years. So anyway, I would appreciate that legislative change, and you got some time because we can't do it till next term, and maybe I won't be here anyway.
I have one, and I know we've been talking about a couple of different things, but these practical difficulties, which is the third point. What are the practical difficulties where people can't, Arts Commission can't, they can't comply with their own rules and their code?
One of them is what I talked about the donation artwork.
Okay.
They have the guidelines. The information is out there that the departments have to follow it. But because of the problem they have getting those departments to follow the guidelines, that is a problem, and I believe they will need some help. So that's the practical issue that I'm talking about. And the other one is the rules and regulations of the commission require a certain percentage of the board members, the commissioners, to be minorities in certain races. And also, that is not being complied with. But I did a research and I found out that it's generally difficult to get that sort of composition. So, and that's another practical issue.
Well, I guess this may go back to Bob's point, and that is, that's not necessarily that's not necessarily their fault either. I mean, I think if either one, the departments letting the Arts Commission know about, just keeping them informed is, the Arts Commission's going to have to go chase after people, right? And on the you all don't select your own board members. That comes out obviously out of the mayor's.
Right, and I think that finding was actually more about organizations that we fund. I think there was a change to the rules and regulations at one point that said we would desire that they would have diverse boards, and then that's sort of that finding. And then I think the donated artworks, you're exactly right. Like if we hear about something coming through, we certainly reach out to the department, or we try to, sort of be proactive in letting departments know that we have this policy, but we can't make them go through the process.
So, and last question, I mean, how, you let them know, but you can't make them do it.
Right.
All right.
Right, and so I think it's a fairly new policy and ordinance, I mean, in the last 3 or 4 years. So we've tried to make it known, and, of course, we work with parks quite a bit, and they have had several come through this process. And, departments that deal with art on a regular basis know about it, but sometimes, something comes out of a department who doesn't normally deal with art or, that kind of thing. That's just like the Sports Authority had, I think a sculpture that was put at the baseball stadium. And, that's like a one-off that they probably don't do that every 10 or 20 years or something like that might come up. So it's just more of an education process, I think, on our part.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Innocent, thank you so much.
Thanks.
You.
We won't be covering the audit of the Metro Nashville General Government Benefits Report because it is still in process with the auditee. We'll move on to unfinished business. The revised investigative report for fire engineering has been on hold until we complete the 4 vendor audits. And just to give you a status of those, EY has completed their draft reports for both theirs. We are now in review of the work papers to make sure that they've met all the criteria and requirements. So that's going to take a little while. Very Dunn they're somewhere in the 70 to 80% complete on both their reports, but they didn't realize it was going to go over into July, and they already had their people assigned to other engagements throughout the month of July, and they won't be available to present those until later in August. So we've discussed, and I've discussed this with Mr. Frazier and Mr. Reed about possibly having a special meeting to discuss all 4 of them at the same time so that they can be compared consistently.
When would that be?
We talked about whether it should be done at the September 10th meeting or if it should be before the September 10th
I guess,
regular meeting.
question for Terry. I think technically our terms in office end on August 31. So I hadn't thought about what that means for a September meeting. And we don't get sworn in for a new term till the end of September.
You could schedule a special meeting before August 31.
Well, do you think that's right? That technically our terms are, I've never understood whether our terms end August 31 or whether, and there's a gap period then where there's like no council, or whether we carry over.
I honestly don't know the answer without looking it up.
On page 64, look at that.
Gina does. Yeah, it shows the term expiration dates. She's right.
Well, those are the audit committee terms. I was thinking more of
the council member.
Yeah.
Because, I mean.
Well, you can figure that out.
I can look into that and follow up. But obviously, if you did set a special meeting before August 31, that would resolve the issue.
Yeah.
Are these firms showing up in person, presenting it to the committee, right?
Yes.
And so do they both have the same deadline they're working with, or they say that they're hitting snags and we have to wait till September? Do we even know if September is going to be?
I mean, I believe we think they will be ready by then.
Okay.
Extra month is correct.
Yes. Now, we have to look at those work papers as well and make sure that they've met all of the requirements, but we believe that they will be. And we can work with them, and I can work with Teresa on.
Sure.
Okay. I did want to have Judge Cottrell to speak on what she's been doing and give a status, and also let us know of a new procedure that went in place July 1.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last thing what you said.
The process that went in place July 1.
Oh, yes, exactly. Well, I think when I was here before, I told you that, well, in sort of looking at this situation based first, upon the audit report and the issues that were pointed out there and everything, I've looked at a lot of different things with the idea of trying to come up with procedures and policies and things we can do to tighten everything up so we don't have similar issues in the future. And one of the first things I realized was that there was a problem with being able to analyze data from A&E contractors, not just Collier, everybody, because the invoices were submitted on PDFs. So there was no ability to electronically look, for example, at one day and see how many hours were billed, even across projects, much less across contracts, much less across Metro. So, because a lot of the contractors have contracts with different departments and different projects under those. So anyway, we developed, working with the finance department and public works, and those were the two main ones, and water services and parks, a system which went into effect. It applies now to all work done July 1st or later. And it is based upon and this is an interim because IT is going to come up with a module to go with what they're doing right now, but they can't get to that yet. So anyway, it went into effect for work done July 1 and later, and it's based on an Excel spreadsheet. And I just met, I guess, last week with Keith Durbin to make sure we will have a way to pull it all together so it'll be central. So in fact, if anybody wants to know when they're reviewing invoices what else was billed to that project or across Metro or whatever, they're going to have the capability to do that. And that just didn't exist before. So I think that will help a lot in sort of being able to look at billings from a number of different ways. The contract, we had a training session with the contractors. We've done training with the Metro employees. So far, I haven't heard any real complaints from the contractors because they already have their computerized systems anyway. But the first invoices will be coming in at the end of July, so I guess if there are any real problems, we'll learn about them then. But anyway, so that's done, and I really think that was a good thing to get accomplished. The audit used as one of the guidelines the standards that are found in the Ethics of Public Contracting section of the Procurement Code, which is a whole different set of, or additional set of ethics standards besides the ones in Metropolitan Code 2.22, whatever, and they particularly apply to people involved in procurement and in contract administration. But apparently a lot of people didn't know that. People out in the departments who do purchasing and who do contract administration were not aware of these standards necessarily, or that they applied to them. So we have been doing some training and with the legal department, and we've done, I guess, 3, and we're going to set up 4 more in August. So we can make sure everybody who's involved in these processes, either before you make the contract or after you make the contract, understands the standards that apply. And I think the real difference, the main difference, is that the ethics and public contracting standards include this appearance of, to avoid the appearance of various things like partiality and that kind of thing. And that's a different standard that luckily judges and lawyers are familiar with how you explain, how you decide what that standard is. So we've been doing that. And we also have I've approved or worked with purchasing on some new contract language that makes clear to vendors that they're covered by those ethics of public contracting too, and that they are agreeing specifically to abide by them. They are covered, but this acknowledges that they know they're covered. We did one of the issues that came up out of the Collier stuff was the use of employees, contract employees, to do constituent services, council services, liaison services. It had various and sundry different names, and as you all are aware, we established a policy that limited those services. And for example, Metro will not pay for a contract employee coordinating with, for example, the mayor's office. I mean, we'll coordinate with, the mayor's office will coordinate with departments themselves. And we limited, there was an issue with council members perhaps and neighborhood associations calling directly the contract employees and ask them to come to meetings and all that stuff, which was apparently good. I mean, the information was getting out and everything, but the department, Public Works in this case, had no control over how many hours were being spent on that or where the people were going. So we've instituted that policy and asked for council members to go through the departments to get that arranged or approved so that the department can decide, okay, we can send an actual employee out in this situation, or we need to use the engineers to do this explanation, the engineers who are on contract. So we did that, and they also, in Public Works, they had part of those services were related to doing service requests. People call in and leave messages and say, there's a lot of speeding here, we need a stop sign, or whatever. It might be like that. And so some of the contractor employees were used to do that. Now they have an employee, a full-time employee, whose job is to get the requests off the hub and direct it to the appropriate either contract employee if it's related to that particular contract, or will do it himself or herself. So that's also been taken care of. I'm going to do scope of contract training, just haven't gotten there yet because of all the other things that have come in. But the scope of contract issues that were identified have been eliminated in those particular contracts, and so that's not happening anymore. We do have a rule that I think is going to the Finance Department Policy Committee, which limits billings for any contractor employees to 40 hours a week without prior approval. And they can get it because, as Sharon has pointed out to me, during paving season, people just have to work a whole lot. So you can get prior approval, but we want to have more control over what those billings reveal. With regard to the actual billings, among other things, I want to wait till we get these. Once I found out that the audit committee had authorized these other audits of the other kinds of the other vendors who have the same kind of business, I really want to see, I want to compare to see if there's any significant difference in the practices or the, what was spelled. I think that's all I have to say, unless you have questions.
The only question I have is particularly with, again, coming back to a new council coming in.
Yes.
Obviously, you had council members over the last couple of years that would just call directly to the vendor. So is that something that we could probably spell out this time early on, right at the very beginning, so people understand the roles of everybody and we don't run into this situation?
I sent an email back when we implemented this to Mike Jameson, who sent it all to you all, and all the departments sent to Mike Jameson's office the contacts in each department that people need to call. So I'm sure if you talk to Mike, he could make sure that gets sent out again when there's
It probably just needs to be made clear right from the very beginning what the process is and what the procedure is. Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions?
No, I think it's great. Thank you
Bill,
for all
thank
that.
you so much.
Thank you.
For being with us.
So now if you'll turn to page 50, I'll give you a budget status.
Gina, is there anything we're going to do?
Nothing else to vote on.
I'm going to exit. Thank you. Sorry for leaving early.
You will see that currently total expenses were under budget by about $283,000. That does not include the payments we will need to make to EY and Barry Dunn, which total about $150,000, and what will be left to pay for my work, another $30,000 to $40,000. So that would still leave about $80,000 to $90,000 under budget. That's a lot of that is the salaries for Mark Swan and a staff person who recently left the department. You'll see at the bottom of the page, there's some calculations there regarding the percentage of co-sourcing that the budget covers, and that's about 16%, which is similar to last year. Any questions about that? If not, we'll go to page 54. These are the ongoing projects of the department. The goal is to complete 27 audit projects during the 2019 year. Currently, there are 6 audit projects that are completed and 4 audit projects are in draft report. We have some that you see are in the planning phase. Questions about those? If you look to pages 55 and 56, you'll see the whole plan. Questions?
No questions?
Okay.
Questions?
On pages 57 and 58, these are the open audit recommendations that we'll be following up on in the month of July. So we will have a report for those during the September 10th regular meeting. Unless you have questions, that's the end of what we have to present today.
All right. Anyone have any questions? Next meeting, July 19th, at 8 a.m. Correct?
Yes.
In this
this
room.
room.
And I think your emails mentioned that the interviews are 1 to 1:30, and then there's an assessment period that follows that.
Mr. Vice Chair, you're going to be bringing food?
We got you covered on food.
Well, yeah, we'll make a recommendation. We're good to food.
Now, if you have special order, Mr. Shulman, you'll need to let me know that.
I had thought that the Vice Chair was going to bring an omelet maker and just...
Well, you know, bananas Foster would be good for
Oh,
dessert.
that'd be great.
You're going to need a different kind of omelet maker for that.
Okay, are there any other items to come up? I guess we need a motion to adjourn. We don't have a quorum, but I guess we adjourn.
I believe a motion to adjourn is the only motion you can make.
Oh, is that right?
Move to adjourn.
Okay, very good.
Right.